Canada's Grand Railway hotels are some of the most iconic buildings in the country. Chances are, if you've been to Canada, you've seen one of these magnificent buildings. These ornate hotels were built at a time when Canada's population was less than 10 million people, and yet even today they stand as some of the most beautiful hotels in the world. So what is the story behind Canada's Grand Railway hotels? Watch this video to find out. The story of the beginning of Canada is the story of its railways. Canada's railways were critical in industrializing a sparsely populated nation both before and after Confederation. They enabled settlement of the West, displacing hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people in the process. Their construction was a condition that would eventually convince British Columbia to join Confederation. In many ways, Canada's railways brought out the best parts of Canada and the worst parts of Canada. Railways first emerged in Canada in the 18th century, and by the 20th century, a number of companies operated railways throughout Canada from coast to coast. Despite the large number of competitors, two railways emerged to dominate the country: the Canadian Pacific Railway, Canada's first transcontinental railway, and the Grand Trunk Railway, which at the time of Confederation was the largest railway system in the world, but suffered from significant financial challenges for most of its existence. The Grand Trunk, and many other small Canadian railways, would eventually be wrapped up through nationalization into the Canadian National Railway, CP's main competitor to this day. In 1875, in response to the expanding Canadian railway landscape, a group of Montreal businessmen decided to build a hotel to serve the elite travelers of this increasingly wealthy city at the heart of the Canadian business world. This hotel, the Windsor Hotel, opened on January 28, 1878, right next to what would become Windsor Station, and quickly became an essential part of the Montreal business and social worlds. Soon considered Montreal's premier hotel, the Windsor Hotel was host to esteemed guests from all over the world, including politicians, royalty, and celebrities from across the globe. Given its convenient location and luxurious accommodations, the Windsor Hotel served as the permanent residences for executives of both the Canadian Pacific Railway and the Grand Trunk Railway for many years. The Windsor Hotel was an undeniable success and prompted a series of hotels across the country to be constructed. The race was on to see who would be able to dominate the Canadian hotel landscape. Given the vast geography of a country the size of Canada, many of the first hotels that the Canadian Pacific Railway would build were small hotels in the mountains of BC. These hotels were designed to function as tourist destinations, but more so to provide a location to feed passengers to avoid having to transport heavy dining cars through the mountains. These hotels were located in a number of locations, including Field, Glacier National Park, North Bend, Revelstoke, Sicamous, Kootenay Lake, and Penticton, BC, among others. These purpose-built hotels would soon become unprofitable, with technological advancements in trains that made dining cars more economical, and all were sold off or demolished. None of these hotels remain standing today. Sensing an opportunity outside of the purpose-built stopover hotels of the past, CP's president, William Cornelius Van Horn, shifted focus towards two types of more permanent establishments: urban and rural hotels. Similar to the Windsor Hotel in Montreal, the urban hotels would be located near a major passenger rail station, typically the wealthiest one in the city, and would accommodate a city's elite tourists, politicians, and businessmen. The first of these new urban hotels to be constructed by CP was the Hotel Vancouver. This hotel was much simpler than the railway hotels we know today, and was not universally loved by locals, with one local newspaper suggesting the building was a monument of external ugliness. Despite this, the Hotel Vancouver would go on to be a resounding success and would inspire CP to construct many more of these urban railway hotels. The strategy behind the new type of rural hotels can be summed up by a quote from William Cornelius Van Horn: "If we can't export the scenery, we'll import the tourists." Van Horn personally selected a location for the first of these hotels, the Banff Springs Hotel, near some natural hot springs in what was then a part of Canada's vast Northwest Territories. This new destination hotel will become so popular that in 1887 Van Horn would convince the federal government to create Canada's first national park, Rocky Mountains Park, now Banff National Park. This would be followed up in 1890 by the Chateau Lake Louise. While both of the original buildings burned down in the 1920s, the current renditions of these buildings are iconic Canadian buildings, with the Banff Springs Hotel even being designated a National Historic Site. And speaking of chateaus, an important shift in the Canadian railway hotel landscape would take place with the construction of the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City. Built in 1893, the Chateau Frontenac was designed to a level of luxury comparable to the highest standards of European hotels at the time. The Chateau Frontenac was constructed in the chateau-esque architectural style pioneered in the United States by wealthy families, including the Vanderbilts. This French revivalist style suited Canada's French colonial heritage perfectly, and the Chateau Frontenac would quickly become one of Canada's most iconic buildings. It would also inspire many future railway hotels to employ this style of architecture, spreading the influence of this style across the country and forever associating the chateau-esque architectural style with Canada. CP would build several more hotels across the country in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, including a hotel for French-Canadian elites in Montreal, the Place Vigée in 1898, and the Empress in Victoria in 1908, in addition to a number of rural hotels. Things for CP were about to change, however, as its biggest competitor, the Grand Trunk Railway, was about to enter the hotel business for itself. Impressed by the success of Canadian Pacific hotels, and unwilling to yield a new industry to its biggest competitor, the Grand Trunk Railway opened its first hotel, the Highland Inn, in 1908 in Algonquin Provincial Park, Ontario, a resort hotel for tourists looking for a wilderness getaway a little closer to home than the mountain hotels in BC and Alberta. This will be followed up with a number of hotels, including the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa, the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg, the Menaki Lodge in Menaki, Ontario, and the Hotel MacDonald in Edmonton. In the same time period, Canadian Pacific Hotels would build the Kootenay Lake Hotel in Balfour, BC, the Royal Alexandra Hotel in Winnipeg, the Palliser Hotel in Calgary, and a replacement for the original Hotel Vancouver, which no longer matched the quality of the prestigious Canadian Pacific Hotels brand. Both companies' hotels would become landmarks in their cities and the center of social life. Built in a large variety of ornate architectural styles, including chateau-esque, Edwardian, and Italian Renaissance, these hotels would bring with them a taste of European-style luxury to booming Canadian business centers like Montreal and Vancouver, but also to upstart prairie cities like Edmonton and Calgary. While competition in the hotel industry was fierce, it had nothing on competition in the railway industry, and in 1919, after financially overextending itself beyond repayment, the Grand Trunk Railway was nationalized as part of Canadian National Railway. A new era had begun in the Canadian railway industry, but if Canadian Pacific thought it was going to be able to coast along to victory in the hotel industry, it would be sorely mistaken. CN would pick up right where Grand Trunk left off. Driven by a booming Canadian economy, the two rivals, Canadian Pacific Hotels and Canadian National Hotels, would produce some of Canada's last true iconic hotel buildings. The 1920s would see CP construct the Hotel Saskatchewan in Regina, the Lord Nelson in Halifax, and the Royal York in Toronto. CN would produce the Jasper Park Lodge in Jasper, Alberta, and the Hotel Newfoundland in St. John's, Newfoundland, which was a separate dominion in the British Empire at the time. But just as the construction of these grand railway hotels was at its peak, the Great Depression began. In the 1930s, CP would construct just one hotel, the rural resort Chateau Montebello in Montebello, Quebec. CN would produce more, partly because the federal government decided that this could be a good way to keep people employed during the Depression. Hotels constructed in this time period include the Nova Scotian in Halifax, Hotel Charlottetown in Charlottetown, and the Bessborough in Saskatoon. In 1939, the construction of a third Hotel Vancouver was completed. This hotel would be unique among railway hotels, as it became a joint venture between CN and CP, who agreed to close the second Hotel Vancouver, as the demand was simply not high enough in pre-World War II Vancouver to support 2 Grand Railway hotels. This new Hotel Vancouver would be the last of the Chateau-esque Grand Railway stations, and with the onset of the war, hotel construction was no longer a priority for either of Canada's major railways. The post-war period would see a fundamental shift away from passenger rail travel that would bring the era of the Grand Railway Hotel to a close. The last Grand Railway Hotel, the Queen Elizabeth, was constructed by CN in 1958. This hotel was constructed in the international style of architecture, a significant departure from the previous hotels. And while the hotel would go on to be another successful addition to the social fabric of Montreal, it would be the final hotel designed with rail travel in mind in Canada. In the years following the construction of the Queen Elizabeth, many of the original Grand Railway hotels would be slated for closure, demolition, or significant renovation. This portion of the story is best illustrated by taking a look at one hotel in detail. So let's dive deeper into the history of the Hotel MacDonald in Edmonton. Once the center of Edmonton's social world, the Hotel MacDonald hosted esteemed guests, including King George VI on his royal tour before the war. In the 1950s, an oil boom would fuel growth in the city, and a major expansion was added to the Hotel MacDonald, totally out of keeping with the ornate style of the original hotel. Locals referred to the hotel and its addition unflatteringly as the Mac and the box it came in. By 1983, the Hotel MacDonald, which was costly to maintain, had fallen out of fashion, and CN made the decision to close the hotel and demolish the box edition. The original building was slated for demolition as well, but the City of Edmonton stepped in and designated the hotel a municipal heritage resource. The hotel sat vacant until it was purchased by CP in 1988, and after extensive renovations, it was reopened by CP in 1991. Today, the hotel is one of the most beautiful and recognizable buildings in the City of Edmonton. While this story is specific to the Hotel MacDonald, similar fights were taking place all across the country to keep these buildings alive, and continue to a degree to this day. Both CP hotels and CN hotels would continue to compete with each other for decades until 1988, when CN Hotels was purchased by CP Hotels, thus ending the competition for supremacy over Canada's Grand Railway hotels. CP Hotels continued to expand and purchased the Fairmont Hotels chain from its American owners in the 90s, and by 2001 all former Canadian Pacific hotels were rebranded as Fairmont Hotels, which were spun off into their own separate company with no ties to CP Rail. And with that, Canada's railways were out of the hotel business, and an era had come to an end. Today, Canada's Grand Railway hotels are some of Canada's most treasured historic buildings, and a part of its cultural heritage. Most, if not all, of these hotels now have some level of historic designation, ensuring their survival for years to come. In downtowns all across the country, these buildings stand out as some of the most beautiful and iconic buildings. From Quebec City to Saskatoon, Lake Louise to Vancouver, these buildings are hard to miss, and are hard not to love. Thanks for watching. Would you like to stay in one of Canada's Grand Railway hotels? Maybe you already have. Let us know in the comments below. And please, if you liked this video, take a second to give it a thumbs up. Every like helps to grow the channel. For more videos like this, please hit subscribe. See you next time.